Living by your hormone cycle is your superpower. In this episode of Beyond the Boardroom, Her Story, I dig into deeply what it looks like to match your hormone cycle with the 4 seasons. So we start with winter, we go into spring, summer, and fall, and how living cyclically really brings it full circle for you to become the best version of yourself. Or from my perspective, you're truly living big. I was trying to figure out what to title this podcast episode, and I was like thinking of like the divinity of the menstrual cycle and like all these things, and I was like, no, I'm going to call it Girl, You're Worth Loving, head to toe, inside and out, because I feel we're going to be talking about periods. We're going to be talking about your menstrual cycle in general, the whole 28 days, what that looks like, because I think so often we treat our periods, especially, and just being a woman is kind of an inconvenience or something that's like, oh, poor us, we have to go through this. And after having babies and after learning more about my cycle, my hormone cycle and how that works, I'm like, this is a freaking superpower. Like, this is so cool that we have access to this. We just need to learn a little bit more about it and apply our superpowers to it and just really lean into that. So that's what we're going to talk about today, which I'm super excited about. So we're really taught to hate our periods. Like, I feel like even commercials back in the day about tampons or whatever, it's just like, pretend like you're not on your period, all these things. Or we're like, PMS has a bad reputation, or all of these things. And so my goal today is to change your mindset and shift it to not only accept this part of your life and a part of being a woman, but to love and lean into your hormones and the cycle that we have to live cyclically and be excited about that. Okay. So that's my intention. That's my goal for today. We expect oftentimes for guys to understand our bodies, but we as women don't oftentimes understand our bodies. And this is one of those ways that we can tap into that part of femininity that's super strong and powerful. And so I want to challenge you to share this knowledge and information, whether this is the first time you've ever heard this, or if you kind of have some background or you live cyclically this way. Either way, I want to challenge you to share your knowledge, because I think, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to teach my daughters this when they're a little bit older, and to even start teaching them this now about my own body. But I wish I would have learned this as a teenager, because my teenage years, I'll get into that in a little bit, my teenage years and into my 20s, I would have lived differently and appreciated my body so much deeper. So there's a power that comes when you're in sync with your body. So what we're going to talk about today are the 4 seasons of your cycle. And I feel like this is such a brilliant way to describe what your body is going through within those 4 seasons. And it's cool to think that our bodies are so similar to nature. So right now, as this podcast is being recorded, it's winter. And that's what we're going to start out with in talking about. Our cycle is our winter cycle, which is your menstrual phase. So think of full moon or dark moon. And this is the easiest one to recognize. So when I'm sitting down with clients and we're talking about this specifically, I think it's easiest to start with this because you're bleeding. It's like very obvious. This is me in winter. Okay. So physiologically, your brain is telling you that you need to go inward, and that's by the drop in your progesterone and your estrogen. So this is the time that you get to do internal work. So you get to surrender to this phase. I think oftentimes we fight it, or like, oh my gosh, I'm on my period, or, Aunt Flo, came to town or whatever. And it's a bad thing. So I want you to trust this slowing down process. So this is truly your anchor. This is where you can draw a lot of insight for yourself from this. So your body signals what you are wanting to be, and on its own in this phase. So I want you to praise this side of you. One two books that I recommend in this is The Bleeding Lodge, and it's interesting because it's about Native American cultures. And then the other one is Red Tent, and it's ancient Israel. That one was like shocking, very, very interesting. And it's not an easy read. You're like really digging in deep and going back through characters and all of that stuff. But it's so interesting to think that back in the day, there was this red tent that when you were bleeding, you would go and be in this red tent. And in a lot of cultures, that's where they would get insights for the community of what should happen, because there were these spiritual downloads that happened. And I just think that is so freaking cool. This is lost when our patriarchal society kind of came to be. And so, but you can still have this within your own home of thinking, what's my red tent? I'm going to talk to God about specific things about my family or my business or my friendships or the things that I need to do, and just go inward. So culturally, we're taught that we shouldn't slow down. I feel like that is something I'm constantly fighting. My masculine is really strong. My feminine, I'm trying to become a little bit stronger in, but I love spreadsheets and structure and discipline and a lot of like masculine qualities. And I'm trying to be more like go with the flow and be in my feminine, which doesn't mean chaos, but it does mean creativity. It does mean listening to my intuition. It does mean not following the structure so perfectly. So the superpower of this phase specifically, of the winter phase, is that you get to rest and you get to have downloads, spiritual downloads specifically. I've started sleeping in, and instead of waking up at the butt crack of dawn, having more sleep. And obviously I'm a mom, so I don't sleep in that much, but till 6:30 or 7 instead of way earlier, or just sleeping a little bit more naturally. Maybe taking more naps and resting can be considered more of your exercise, doing more yoga or stretching and just having rest for your body, leaning into that. When you're working out, you don't need to work out so hard. And we're going to talk about what exercise looks like between all 4 of these seasons. The next one is spring. So this is your follicular phase. So you're usually more creative. If you've been resting during your winter, you will naturally have this like rebirth and energy and to explore the world around you and maybe apply some of those things, start to apply some of those things of the downloads that you got in your winter section of your cycle. So you're still taking it, gentle and slow, not so crazy as summer we'll get into in a second, but you're kind of winding up. So I have an example of this. When I had Chandler, she's now almost 3, but when she was born, I took 2 weeks off, which is really hard for me because I love what I do. And so working doesn't actually feel like work for me, but I was like, okay, intentionally, I'm going to take 2 weeks off and I'm not going to touch my work at all. And it is so crazy because that was like a full-on winter experience for me. And I got so many ideas. Like I'm actually writing a children's book right now, and we took a year off. I'm writing it with my sister. It's called Live Big Little Girl, and we're almost done with it. But that like period of 2 weeks was when I came up with that idea. And I came up with all these different ideas for my business, and I wrote them down and I journaled them, and I really went inward with what I wanted to do coming up. And I look at the next year or 2 or 3 of what happened after taking that solid 2 weeks of rest. And I can attribute so many of the ideas and direction that I went with my business to taking that rest. So it's interesting because I don't know if you're like me, but I really have a hard time comparing or recognizing within myself, like what is productive. I feel like productive is busy, and productive is, like I said, my masculine, like doing all of these things that I have on my to-do list. And really being productive can include that rest time. And I've seen that time and time again. And sometimes I have to remind myself like, hey, slow down, and that this is still productive and you're not lazy, and all of these things that I have some beliefs that I am still working through. But it's so cool to see the superpower of this. So Some of the superpowers specifically of spring are that you can start implementing some of those ideas. And I also think of spring as kind of like you're excited, you're kind of warming up to what's happening in the summer, and you're kind of leading into that. So for exercise within this cycle, you might want to pick things up to use your hormones for transitioning into harder training. So you can get back to lifting and running, but maybe you're just not pushing it quite as far as you totally can. That leads us into summer. So what's cool about summer in your cycle is this is usually everyone's favorite. You have all this energy, you're social, you're verbal, you're better looking physiologically. It's like so crazy that because of your hormone cycle in your summer, you're more sexually attracted to your partner. Your partner is probably more sexually attracted to you. It affects your brain and sexual organs. To me, that's just so crazy that your hormones affect all of those things. So I want you to think, maybe this has happened to you. Have you ever worked out in your summer phase and done the same exact workout in your winter phase and wondered like why you can't lift as much or your stamina is different? I think for the longest time, I was like, what is wrong with me? Like, oh, it must be my eating, or, oh my gosh, it must be I didn't get enough sleep, or all these things. And I kind of like look for all these external reasons for why I wasn't performing the way that I wanted to. I think of my volleyball days in high school, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, if I understood this, I would have used so much less brain space on why things were different, or why I couldn't jump as high, or why I couldn't move the way that I wanted to. That would have been so crazy to actually have this information at my fingertips. So another thing that I like to do specifically with my summer is I plan my trips around summer. So Shane and I went to Bali this last year for our 10-year anniversary. And I planned our trip so that I would be there during summer and my summer phase, right? And same with our Destin Live Big Collective trip. We went to Destin, Florida last year, and I planned the trip so that I would be in my summer. And the reason for that is because I knew I was going to be in charge of all of these women. I wanted to make sure that I showed up my best, that I was the most social, that I was the most energetic, all of these things. So not always can you plan trips around that, but if you have the flexibility to figure out, especially if your hormone cycle is regular, then you can strategically plan out some of these things to just make it the best that it can be. Another like hot tip is don't let summer girl plan your schedule. She can't do it all month, right? And I think I've learned that I would say I've learned that the hard way, where maybe winter is where I do all of my planning, where I'm coming internally and I'm figuring out like what I really need to do the rest of the month. And then summer girl can execute, but she's not planning all the plans. How many times have you been like, oh, let's do this and this and this and this with all these people? And then you get there and maybe you're in your fall or winter or spring and you're just like, oh my gosh, why did summer girl plan all the plans? Okay. So the superpower of this phase is you're fun, energetic, you plan events or getaways at times that you're feeling the most social, and this is your highest sex drive. So exercise for this is when you can train the hardest, you listen to your body, but you're going hard with this. And for me, I think I'm going to wake up early. I'm going to get things done. I'm going to be social, like all of the things that I've already mentioned. It's just a shift in how you strategically lay out your entire month. The last one I want to talk about is fall. So this is your luteal phase, so premenstruum, or oftentimes we call it PMS. One book that I love is called Wild Power. And one of the things it talks about is it talks about the men's cycle being every 24 hours, it resets. And a woman's cycle is 27.32, I think, 27.32 days. And so that is so different. Like just understanding that a men's cycle is 24 hours and a woman's cycle is pretty much 28 days that just shifts how you look at things. So I want you to think, if a man hadn't slept in his entire cycle of 24 hours, how would he show up? He'd probably be, very grumpy. He'd be quick to respond. He would be all these things that we associate PMS with, right? Well, if you're never taking a break and you're never resting, guess what? That's how PMS shows up. So once I realized this, I was like, oh my gosh, now that I've practiced this, I don't have typical PMS symptoms because I'm resting. And so if you're just go, go, go all the time and you never rest, just like a man would be having all those same PMS symptoms of not resting, that's how you show up. So just by following this, you're going to have a way better fall in your hormone cycle. So I'll give you an example. My junior year of high school, I was literally grounded the entire year. So it wasn't that my parents said, oh, you're grounded for a year. But what would happen is I didn't understand this cycle of mine. So what would happen is I would be super sassy to my parents, and it was probably in my fall time. I'd be sassy and I'd get grounded for a month. and I was kind of a crazy teenager, but I'd get grounded for an entire month. And so then the rest of the month, I was like pretty good. I was like, whatever. And then it would come again and I'd get grounded again for a month. And it was literally like my whole junior year. And finally I realized this on my own. I'm like, oh my gosh, this keeps happening. Like, what's the pattern here? And I was like, okay, I just feel a little crazy for myself. I don't feel like myself in my luteal phase in fall. And so I just need to take a chill pill and just recognize that I need to be a little bit more patient with myself. And I communicated that with my parents. I was like, hey, I'm kind of recognizing a pattern here. I need to show up differently and I need to be a little bit more patient. And also, can you be more patient with me? And that literally fixed it. And I felt like after that, then I didn't have this crazy Andrea time that sometimes I felt. And again, if I would have known this, what was actually happening and that I needed to rest in other aspects of other times in my life, I think I would have showed up differently. So if you're feeling that way when you're PMSing, right, it doesn't have to be a negative connotation anymore. It can just be okay, I need to be more patient and I also need to rest in the winter so that by the time fall comes, I don't feel not like myself. I can show up how I want to. Also with fall this is our inner critic and this is truly our superpower. So those times when certain things are bothering you and you're quick to kind of be snappy or whatever, instead of being snappy, just be curious and be okay, why is that bothering me? And maybe that's actually something that I need to have a conversation on. When you think of the opposite, when you think of summer girl, oftentimes we're just happy-go-lucky, whatever, and you can kind of let things slide. And I think that's a good thing. But then also in fall, it's a good thing that you can be why is that irritating me so bad? And that's something that you're maybe I need to have a conversation with someone about that because I've kind of buried that or I hid that. With fall, one of my other things about it is this is kind of a nesting period. So when you're pregnant, your body is preparing for a big job that you need to do, and you're clearing out distractions and clearing out the home to prepare for this baby to come. And so fall is kind of like that. So maybe you're finishing projects and desire to organize and kind of smoothing things out to prepare for winter. It's so interesting to think that's when the leaves fall in nature, and that's when it's preparing all of us for that quieter time that winter brings. So those are all of them: winter, spring, summer, and fall. And it's crazy that this is the creation process over and over. Winter are those downloads, and spring are the ideas, and summer is the implementation, and fall is bringing and wrapping up those projects. And you're just doing this creation process over and over again, whether you're the CEO of your home, whether you're a business owner, whatever that might look like. I love this traditional Native American proverb. It's at her first bleeding, a woman meets her power. during her bleeding years, she practices it. And at menopause, she becomes it. And we're going to talk about this in a minute. If you don't bleed or you're trying to figure out how to live cyclically, we'll talk about that in a second. But it's interesting that if you do have a normal cycle, that when you're kind of learning how this works when you first start your period, and then during your bleeding years, you're practicing that and really like honing in on who she is. And then menopause, you don't bleed anymore. But I hope that you've practiced so much in your bleeding years that you are still living that cyclical life. So this next section is nutrition, exercise, and lifestyle all play a part of how you prepare for menopause, and perimenopause can even be in your 30s. So again, what happens if you don't bleed? My mom, this is crazy because I'm going to be 35 this year, and my mom had a series of 5 surgeries in less than 3 months, and it ended with, so this was when she was 35, it ended with a full hysterectomy, emergency hysterectomy. So it messed with her hormone cycle crazy. And she went into a depression and anxiety struggle for a really long time. And it was interesting to watch from a child's perspective because I was like 15, 16 when it happened. And it was just crazy to just kind of see this happen. But I think of how things changed when she finally got her hormones figured out. And so I want to challenge you that if you're like, you don't bleed or there's something that you don't know the answer to, it's so important to figure out what is going on with your hormone cycle, because as you can tell, there's all these superpowers that you can lead into. And obviously, I'm not like a medical professional or anything like that, but I've personally had experiences where I've gone to get my hormones figured out after having babies. And I had an IVF experience this last year to bring a baby into the world. And it messes, when your hormones are off, it messes with everything. And so I just want you to become super intent on figuring out what needs to happen so that you can be back on track with your hormones. When you become an observer of your cycle, you can follow the moon. There's lots of different resources out there that you can follow the moon if you don't bleed. But the important part is that you live cyclically. We are cyclical beings. So I have found that I am more productive because I rest and recognize what my body is telling me. I will randomly get comments sometimes where people are like, oh my gosh, you're doing all these things. How are you doing all these things? Or like, I can't keep up or whatever. And I'm like, oh, no. It's so different than you think. I think people think that I'm go 24/7, 365, where it's like, no, I am way more productive and way more effective and way more intentional because with everything that I do, because I follow my hormone cycle. And so when you think of that hormone cycle of men of the 24 hours, I used to compare myself to Shane and be like, we are eating the same. We are sleeping the same amount. Like, how is he just feeling like bright and chippy and whatever in the morning? And I'm like, I am exhausted. Like, why am I like struggling so much? And as I've followed my own feminine cycle, it's given me a lot of empowerment to be like, oh no, I'm living my best life. I'm living big by following this instead of comparing myself to a man or my husband specifically. So if you think of that hormone cycle of men, we live very much in a world where it is based on a man's cycle. For example, they start out with spring in the morning. So they have this energy, they're like ready to go. And you're like, how are you doing that every single day? It's because their hormone cycle reset. Then in summer, think of like the working hours. They're golfing, happy hour, board meetings, social hour, right? That's like all during the day. And then if you think of fall, oftentimes men will come home from work and they'll want to unwind, connect, they'll disconnect, they'll watch TV. Though that's like a total fall like preparation for winter, right? So that makes sense. So give them some grace because that's their hormone cycle as well. Not saying that you should just let them watch TV or whatever, but maybe they need to unwind. Maybe they need to you need to recognize that their hormone cycle is not at its peak summer situation like it is during the day. And then winter is sleep and rest. And so they have this whole cycle going over and over every day. And so they get to be in their superpower of that. We get to be in our superpower of our 28-day cycle. Okay. The last thing I want to focus in on is just bringing home the idea that this is something we get to lean into and that we get to love and that we get to adore about our bodies. Instead of hating it or dreading it, we get to lean into it from a superpower standpoint. So an example of this is the U.S. women's soccer team won the World Cup, and there's lots of articles about this, but I love, it was in 2019, but they trained like women instead of training like men. So what that looked like is they honored the way that their bodies are wired and they worked with it instead of against it. And again, I don't really know the logistics of like, were they all on the same cycle or like, how did this work? But they trained according to their individual cycles, and they attribute their winning the World Cup in 2019 to training with their cycle. And I just think instead of trying to be like a man, we get to stand in our femininity of being like, how can we adjust our everyday life to show up effectively with our hormone cycle? And I think the devil wants us to hate our bodies or to be obsessed with our bodies and to cause a distraction from tapping into our own intuition. And that's by being busy. That's by go, go, go. That's by never taking a rest and never coming into ourselves. So that would be my challenge, that as women, let's all find our superpowers and help other women, whether it's our daughters or our moms or grandmas or other women in our life, to live cyclically so that we can stand in our truth and stand in our superpowers as women. And I have seen that so much in my own life. So I can give a testimony for that for sure, that I have seen that over and over and over in my own life, but I love to see that with other women. So even if this is new information, I want you to dig into it. I'm going to include some of my favorite resources in the show notes. I have lots of books I would recommend, and then also some Instagram accounts that you can follow. Those will all be in the show notes. But if this is old news for you, I want you to think of one way that you can lean into your cycle of, thinking winter, spring, summer, fall. What's something that you can do to really implement this new system to access the power within you?